But we are electing the most powerful peacetime president virtually every 4 years. Well, how did this happen? How did this happen? Well, it turns out it's a very human thing. It's a very human thing. It's a combination of fear and politics over the course of decades that created this environment. And it was sadly compounded by a mistake, a conceptual mistake that the founders made when they were conceiving this new American republic. And now when I say that, there are so many things that founders got right, but they're human beings. There are things that they got wrong as well. And so it's very important for Americans living in 2024 to be acknowledged what they got right and to acknowledge what they got wrong and respond accordingly, okay? So let's first talk about fear. I'm not going to talk about the presidency in times of existential crisis, like the Civil War or World War II. Those are circumstances that are different outside of our normal experience. I'm going to talk about how fear in normal experiences, in normal times, began to lead to extraordinary presidential power. And let's begin with late June of 1950. In late June of 1950, the North Korean army poured over the border of South Korea in a massive surprise attack that surprised certainly many people in the Pentagon, certainly many people in the international community, and immediately the President of the United States at that time, Harry Truman, had a choice to make. And it was not just a choice of, do I send troops or not send troops? It was, do I go to Congress or do I not go to Congress? Now, if you're going to send large numbers of soldiers into an active combat zone to engage in an army that numbered at the time in the hundreds of thousands, I don't know, I think that meets the definition of a war. I'm just out on a limb here, out on a limb. Air, land, sea battle at scale between vast armies, yeah, I would call that a war. So the UN Security Council, in one of its first really decisive acts in its history, condemned the invasion of South Korea, and authorized a UN response. Truman, in the emergency moment, sends troops. He even consults with some congressional leaders. But you know what he never does? He never goes to Congress to get congressional authorization for the Korean War. Now, I think Congress would have given it. So part of people say, well, no harm, no foul. No, big harm, big foul. He does not go to Congress. Instead, to get out of this, and some folks who are like deep into history nerdery, love you all, will know, here's how he did it. He did a sleight of hand. He said, it's not a war, it's a police action. It's a police action. Well, that was not tenable to anyone. I mean, by late 1950, early 1951, 52, we're not just fighting North Korea, we're fighting an enormous Chinese army, just enormous. There's open discussion of using nuclear weapons. Now, there are rogue cops in America. None of them have threatened nuclear release, right? So this can't be a police action. This is not a police action. We're talking about war, right? And so what this does is this is the first really hot part of the long Cold War. And what happens over this long Cold War is over time, the president essentially becomes something like a freestanding war leader with war leader powers in the absence of an actual declared war on many fronts, in many ways. So Truman, in the middle of the Korean War, actually tries to seize control of steel manufacturing in the United States of America, tries to seize control of it in face of labor unrest. And we begin to see a development of what became known as sort of the imperial presidency. And what were some of the characteristics of the imperial presidency? Well, one of them is the imperial president could order nuclear launch on his own authority without congressional action. Now, there are some reasons for this. It's not time for congressional votes if Soviet missiles were coming in. But then they began to delegate to the presidency enormous amounts of authority that the president can use at his or her discretion entirely. A lot of you folks may remember the Trump travel ban litigation, where he banned immigrants from a number of countries, most of them majority Muslim countries. Some of them were currently engaged in civil conflict. And he did so under a statutory authority that a lot of people didn't know even existed. And the statutory authority, this is Cold War era stuff, said that the president has the power to ban any alien or class of aliens from entry into the country, basically if the president thinks it's necessary. Congress said, hey, we have congressional power over immigration. Here you go, Mr. President. You now have our power to ban any alien or any class of aliens. There's a long-standing law, one that has existed in various forms since early in the American Republic, called the Insurrection Act. And this Insurrection Act, as it has grown and developed, has become so broad that what happened is now the President of the United States can order active duty U.S. troops, active duty, the 101st Airborne Air Assault Division, 82nd Airborne. You can order them into an American city on the President's own initiative, on the President's own initiative. That is a remarkable power, just a remarkable. I can do this all day. And so a lot of this was related to this idea that in this existential struggle with the Soviet Union, which never went hot in the way that our fight with Nazi Germany did or Imperial Japan, thank God it never did. But essentially, we were treating the president as if he was like a wartime leader, even when we weren't at war. So that's part of the fear. But let's bring in the politics. And this gets us to the founders. And the politics became very clear that if you're a member of Congress, over time in American history, you began to see yourself not primarily as a member of Congress who is shepherding and husbanding and using congressional power wisely, but you began to see yourself more as a member of your political party. And so rather than the supremacy or the power of your branch of government dominating your mind, what was dominating your mind was the power of your political faction. Okay, why does this matter so much? Well, over time it became clear that the President of the United States began to assume three roles. Only one of them constitutionally, or two of them, constitutionally mandated. So the three roles are head of the executive branch of the government, clearly constitutional, head of state, in the way that, for example, the King of England is the head of state. This is the person who shows up at the funerals of world leaders, who addresses the nation. You remember when Queen Elizabeth addressed the United Kingdom at the onset of the COVID emergency in this really moving speech where she remembered the Blitz in 1940 and how the Brits hung together then and they can hang together now. That's a classic head of state function. And some of the finest moments of American presidents, Democratic or Republican, have been in that head of state function. I can think of on the Democratic side, you remember when Barack Obama began to sing Amazing Grace at Mother Emanuel Church. That's not head of executive branch behavior. That's head of state. This is, I am manifesting and demonstrating the power of moral leadership and the power of compassion in a dark moment in American history. On the Republican side, the moment when President Reagan, at the 40th anniversary of the D-Day invasion, gave his very famous "These are the boys of Point du Hoc" speech, which was beautiful tribute to these veterans. So many more of them 40 years ago were living then than are living now. That's head of state. And this is a very important and powerful role granted to the president. Also, the president is the head of the executive branch. We'll talk about that a lot. But the other thing that they've become is the head of the political party. So the president is essentially the head of President Biden is essentially the most important person in the Democratic Party. They are the person who really, truly leads the Democratic Party. President Trump, former President Trump, I want to be very clear, former President Trump, was the nominee of the Republican Party, and we all know, does he exercise any influence over Republicans? It's really hard to tell, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say he rules with an iron fist. And so they became the heads of their political faction. And so the way this works is that when you became a member of Congress and you are elected as a Republican or a Democrat, you are part of a faction that is controlled by or led by the president, or sort of the president in waiting, the leading contenders for the presidency in the next time. And even if you don't have a nominee, you are an opponent of the president if you're out of power. This faction becomes very important. Now, how did the founders kind of mess this up? All right, so the way that they kind of messed this up was that when they were drafting the Constitution, they believed the big threat was one branch of government as a branch of government trying to crush the others. In other words, Congress saying, we in Congress are going to run this place, which is very different from saying we as Republicans or we as Democrats are going to run this place. And so they created very close controls on the ability of any branch of government to dominate another. Again, the legislature is supreme, but it's not uncheckably supreme. There are checks on the legislature. So they are very concerned about these branches of government. And of course, some of this is rooted in English history. There were wars between branches of government in England, between the monarchy and parliament, for example. We didn't want that. We didn't want a congressional army facing off against a presidential army in the field of battle. And so there are a lot of good reasons for this. But at the same time, the Constitution made very little accommodation for the other danger that was also on the founders' minds, but that they didn't really truly enact any formal constraints on. And this is the power of faction. Now, if you go back to George Washington's farewell address and you reread it, and many of us are refamiliarized with it through the theatrical documentary called Hamilton, which quotes liberally from the Washington's farewell address. He was very concerned about faction. He was very concerned about the rise of political parties and how they could corrupt American government. Also, if you read Federalist Number 10, which we all know is the best Federalist paper, if you read Federalist Number 10, you'll notice that James Madison, one of the absolute key founders, it's not unfair to call America a Madisonian democracy, that James Madison, one of the key founders, wrote an entire Federalist paper on the danger of faction. And what was his solution to the danger of faction? His solution was to expand the sphere of liberty so that many factions could thrive. And the existence of many factions would dilute the power of any one faction so that there would not be dominance, control, tyranny. But the problem was, what if we didn't have many factions that arose? We had two factions that arose. That's not many, that's two. That's two. And then what happens if the prime focus of a member of Congress isn't on making Congress strong? It is make Republicans strong, make Democrats strong. And so what began to happen over time is we reached a point at which the members of Congress began to punt up to the presidency the powers that Congress traditionally held, or turning a blind eye when the president, so long as it was of their own party, asserted or usurped the powers of Congress. Why? Why would they turn a blind eye? Because their loyalty to faction was more important than the loyalty to branch of government. So this creates a dynamic that is dangerous and unstable in some very important ways, even when the presidency is held by good men or women. So even when the presidency is held by people who are ethical and honorable, even if you might disagree with them, if all of this awesome power is invested in even good or decent men or women, you're still going to create all of the strains that I talked about before. The strains of, am I casting a meaningful vote? Do I really have a meaningful role in this democracy? Does my voice matter at all? These kinds of things really do matter when the president is too strong, even if the president is a good person. Because good people aren't perfect. Even good people aren't perfect, and you want to have a democratic check on their power. And if we make even good people more powerful, then we are making our democracy less stable.